Absolutely. You mentioned something a little bit ago. You mentioned the difference between succession planning and continuity planning. Let's get into that for a minute. So, can you get into a little bit about the differences between the two and why both are important to have?
Yeah, continuity planning, if there's anything anyone takes away from today, this is probably the thing I'm most evangelical about. I believe that a continuity plan is a essential component that every single independent advisor needs to have in place.
Agreed.
And let me elaborate on that a little bit. If you were to go, if you pretend you're a consumer and you want to go hire an advisor, you walk into a Merrill Lynch office, you will have a Merrill Lynch advisor for life. You don't have
Hmm.
to worry about what happens to your Merrill Lynch advisor. You will always have a Merrill Lynch advisor.
Hmm.
Now, if you go hire an independent advisor, that might not be the same case. And case in point, like I hired my first advisor in 2014. I'm still with that advisor, but I don't know why I said my first. And I did not choose my parents' advisor
Interesting.
because it was a one-man shop, and I
Hmm.
realized that that person who is a good advisor for my parents is probably not going to be around when I retire. And there's no clear path as to who's going to be there in that business. I don't believe
Hmm.
that business will be there in 30 years. So that was a good reason for me to go out and find an organization where I knew I
Yeah.
wasn't going to have to find another advisor again. So if my parents' advisor, for example, had said to them, I have a continuity plan in place. If anything happens to me, this is what's going to happen to you. I might have had a little bit more confidence in working with that advisor myself. And
Sure.
so
Sure.
just having anything that says, in the event of my death or disability, this is what's going to happen to my staff if I have any employees, like who's going to write their payroll check the day after I pass away, what's
Mm.
going to happen to those clients, and what's going to happen to my family. The continuity plan should spell all those answers out.
Yeah.
You're usually picking someone who is going to be either a guardian of the business for a period of time until the business can be sold, and that person might help the estate find an appropriate buyer. Maybe they can just keep taking care of the clients until that time comes. Oftentimes, that person who's willing to do that is often willing to buy the business as well, and you come up with what are the terms and conditions of that transaction ahead of
Sure.
time because you're not going to be around if a triggering event occurs for death or disability. You're not there to make those negotiations happen anymore. So
Right.
that's really the difference with continuity planning. Whereas succession, it's someone that's working with your organization that does the same thing you do, that they are usually an advisor themselves, and they're in a position to gain an equity stake in the company. And maybe it's just 10% of the business. You see how that goes after the first tranche of sale, maybe do another 10% or 20%. And over time, that person or persons, I'd even recommend having a succession team. We usually recommend two G2s for each G1, second generation versus first generation. In case anything happens to one of your two G2s, maybe they decide they don't want to do it. Maybe you decide they're not a good partner. Maybe your business has gotten to be so valuable that it's too expensive for just one person to buy out on
Mm.
their own. So a
Mm.
succession planning team of multiple people would be ideal, but that takes a lot more time, a lot more planning, and the actual execution and implementation of it can take 10 to 20 years. And so we
Sure.
recommend people start doing
Sure.
succession planning maybe around age 50 or about 20 years before you plan to retire. Continuity planning, on the other hand, should happen the day you open your doors.
That's interesting, Scott, and I appreciate you talking about that. So, just because you have a continuity plan in place with somebody doesn't mean that that person is going to be your successor. It just means that you've planned for your clients to be taken care of in the event that something were to happen to you, and it happens. It happens
That's
all the time. Let's go to kind of the dark side of this. Let's say that an advisor has neither a succession plan nor a continuity plan in place, right? What's the default plan? I've got some thoughts on that, but I'm going to let you go first.
so there's kind of this spectrum of protection, if you will. And on the far end of no protection, you don't have any type of plan in place whatsoever. The next step
Hmm.
would be you find somebody and you have a verbal agreement with them. That's not really a plan if it's not written, it's not executable, it's not enforceable. So that's really kind of the bare minimum to have in place next. Then I would say to have some type of guardian agreement where you have something in writing, like I said, someone that can take care of the clients, take care of the business. It can be someone within your own organization. Maybe it's your director of operations, or someone who you trust that can continue to keep the business afloat long enough that there's not client attrition. It could be somebody that you know across the street. It could be a competitor that you're not necessarily viewing truly as a competitor, but it's someone who does the same thing you do, but just with another
Sure.
organization. If you're with a broker dealer, it would be ideal to find someone that's within that same broker dealer,
Yep.
but it's not a requirement that be the case. But implementation wise, it gets to
Sure.
be a little bit easier. But then on that far end, the best continuity plan is, again, having a full-blown succession plan, having another partner in the
Yep.
business where if you're owning an LLC, we have written, assuming you had FP transitions do the work, we will write into the corporate governance documents, what are all these terms and conditions? What are all those contingencies that could possibly happen where if anything happens to one of the two owners or three owners, what happens? How do the other ones buy them out? What are the processes for that? So that's
Yep.
kind of the spectrum of least to most protected. There is kind of what we call a practice emergency plan, where we do help advisors just say, I have it written down that in the event anything happens to me, my estate is going to contact FP, ask FP to put it out for sale on the open market as quickly as possible, and try to get the most highest dollar we can for the best fit for the clients, and the estate still gets paid, the clients still get taken care
Sure.
of. So at least if you have that in writing and we're ready to go, we can usually get better price on that than if someone just comes to us out of the blue. We didn't have anything planned,
Yeah.
didn't know anything about them.
Yeah. Great points. And, I think a default plan can also be, for a firm like a broker dealer firm or an RIA firm, if they have an advisor who's affiliated with them that either becomes incapacitated, can't run their practice, or
Yep.
they die, the default plan can be, we are going to make those accounts house accounts, or we're going to reassign those accounts to advisors. Neither of those scenarios are necessarily what's in the best interest of the client.
Right.
So the only one that wins there really is the firm. The
Correct.
client doesn't win, the advisor doesn't win, the advisor's family doesn't win. It's a horrible situation to put everybody into. I'm reminded of a
It's a
conversation that
gamble, and when you gamble, the house wins.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Um, I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with an advisor. This is going back about 4 years ago. But we were talking about our time in the business, and this particular gentleman has been in the business for about 30 years or so, has a great practice, has a lot of clients, drives great revenue. But somehow the conversation got turned into a conversation about succession planning. And I could tell he was getting a little bit fidgety, and he stopped the conversation. He said, John, he said, I don't believe in succession planning. He said, I've thought about it. He said, I don't believe in it. And I kind of scratched my head because I've never really heard an advisor say that before. And he said, let me tell you the deal. Here's the deal. He said, I'm going to do this till I can't do it anymore. And then when I can't do it anymore, my clients can figure it out. Now, that caught me by surprise, because I can just imagine if his clients were to know that, how that would make them feel. But then I also got to thinking about that conversation. I thought, well, for all the advisors out there who do not have a plan in place, um, they're basically saying the same thing to their client. They're just not audibly saying it. And I would also think that there's a lot of value once you have a plan in place, Scott, both succession plan and a continuity plan, to let your clients know about that plan. Would you agree? Let them know about
It's
it.
it's vital, and the amazing thing is our data shows that firms that communicate that grow. There
Hmm.
is a growth to be had from that because the clients can breathe a sigh of relief. They know what's
Sure.
going to happen. It opens up the doors for referrals. And particularly when you've got a succession plan in place, that is a drastic growth changer. So
Hmm.
when we
Hmm.
look at the data, so again, we do 1,000 valuations a year. We've got over 15,000, I think it's 16,000 now, firms that we've done valuations for. So we've got a massive database that we can look at and draw certain trends. And one of the most obvious ones to me when I got here was the growth rate of net new clients of single owner firms versus multi-owner firms. So when you bring in someone else into ownership, you bring in that successor, that G2, they become an owner. They are taking on a massive amount of debt because they
Sure.
usually don't have the money to buy in for cash. So if you've got a business worth $5 million, someone's buying 10%, They're actually, the value is worth less than 500,000, but that's a discussion for another day. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, it's a simple math and it's worth $500,000 for them to buy 10%. A 35-year-old, 40-year-old most likely doesn't have $500,000 laying around to invest. So they're going to have to take out
Yeah.
a note, either seller financed or bank financed. And the way they're going to pay that off is they're now getting 10% of the profit distributions of the company.
Mhm.
How do they pay off that note faster? By larger profit distributions. How do you get larger profit distributions? That G2 goes out and they bust their butt even harder now
Sure.
because they care more about the profit distributions than ever before.
Yeah.
So we see this surge of activity, and it is with, generally speaking, very valuable clients, because a
Hmm.
G2 is more likely to attract people that are around their age. They're going to bring in people who are in their peak accumulating years, rather than the G1, who might be having a
Yeah.
lot of clients who are in their peak
Yeah.
declining years in terms of
Yeah.
the value that they're bringing. Meanwhile, because they've offloaded some of those ownership responsibilities we talked about earlier, those G1s now have freed up capacity. They're seeing the G2 start to really crush it and going out and bringing in new business. They're feeling competitive. They've got the capacity now. They go out. It's what we call the rejuvenation effect. So those
Mm.
G1s go out and start bringing in new business. So you're seeing a difference of growth rates of around 12% for a single owner versus 22% for a multi-owner firm. So again, for the advisor that's saying like, well, this doesn't make sense for me financially, I would push back and say, would you rather own 12% growth and own 100% of it, or own 80 to 90% of a company growing at 22%? The math is
Right.
pretty easy on that.
Yeah, absolutely.